den rechten.
Bir müşteri olan
Den rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Moving forward.
Yves Jouffe from LVMT. That's yet another acronym, are you sure? LVMT, what does that mean? City Mobility Transport Laboratory. And if star, do you want the acronym? Explain. As soon as you use an acronym, you have to explain it. Well, we'll run over time then. Anyway, we'll stick to École des Ponts et Chaussées and Leslie Béton from the French Institute of Transport, Development and Network Sciences and Technology. Anyway, our title may sound a bit negative, but we're going to look at an empirical survey carried out by Leslie based on household practices, humble households living in the peri-urban. We'll explain where we met these households, and we want to put these uses of energy for mobility and housing in the context of a triple constraint: economic constraints, social constraints related to standards, and environmental constraints which have to do with demands placed on people, symbolic constraints that defines the triple vice of peri-urban and sustainability. Here to put this interpretation framework into context very quickly, let's talk about the discourse about the peri-urban. Two types of discourse, not just one, that are at loggerheads, but that also overlap. They are not consecutive, but simultaneous. One looking negatively at single-family houses and car use, judgment passed by the urban elites on political decision-making to criticize cars and detached houses that are bad for everybody's quality of life. The second discourse is related to houses as the house, the detached house, as a legitimate aspiration, what it has to offer, security, the control over your environment. This is a discourse that's produced by most buyers, builders, developers, energy providers. This is something that you can see in the illustrations. Urban planners, politicians who all support and give legitimacy to this aspiration. These discourses highlight two types of constraints on humble households and their practices. Here, let's look at their energy practices, their uses of energy for, as I said, daily mobility, but also for housing users. First of all, the first discourse imposes ecological demands, where the peri-urban is detrimental both to city and countryside. The peri-urban pollutes both other types of spaces. There are also social standards, which I've explained, the second discourse that gives a lot of positive values to the peri-urban, but also imposes constraints in terms of personal success and self-fulfillment. So many things that will happen more in the peri-urban, because the peri-urban benefits from the best of both town and country. And the third constraint that defines the third dimension of this vice, about the way households use energy, namely the energy constraint, making this equation intractable. They can't go back to the city center because it's too expensive, or they can't do some home improvement work to insulate them or invest in a more eco-friendly car. I'll hand over to Leslie, who, based on the interviews that she did will try to answer how peri-urban households cope with these three constraints. Do they have environmental concerns? And are their practices environmental themselves? Okay, very quickly, because as researchers, well, that's something we can't help but do, but I'll share with you a few results from a broader survey with 30 households in peri-urban areas that depend on the car. Here you can see on the map where we did the survey. These were towns in Seine-et-Marne and in Côte d'Or, in the east of Dijon. I'm sorry there's no scale on this map. Geographers will forgive me. I know it's from Google Maps, but that's no excuse. And when you ask how households cope with these three constraints and how they take environmental demands into account and try to find answers, they don't really seem to care about them. They don't really talk about these demands spontaneously. You have to ask them questions about that to elicit a response from them. So it doesn't seem to be a very effective pressure, this environmental pressure. And although they recognize this environmental constraint, they oppose it with daily constraints. When Sandra is asked about a possibility of cutting on her commute, well, she won't do that. She needs to go shopping, pick up the kids, all the important stuff. No, I'm not going to change anything. So these daily constraints are opposed to peri-urban social standards and aspirations, having a detached house and a certain level of consumption. Here it's a quote from Vincent who says, "If you really want to become green, then we'll live in wooden shacks in the middle of the forest and tell people no gas, no power, no cars. If you want veg, you can fetch them from your garden. If you want to eat rabbits, well, breed them at the back of the garden." Do you think people are going to go back to that? Candlelight, no TV, no internet, no driving to work. You would have to take a horse carriage to go to work. That will be environmental, but we'll never go back to that. We've reached a point of no return. That's a real problem. These are the answers that are generally made by these people. And these daily constraints and with these aspirations, there are also economic constraints, having a decent standard of living despite the resources that you have and that are in line with social standards. These are concerns that are seen as legitimate and that offset, that neutralize and cancel the environmental demands placed on these households. So they find arrangements with their ecological conscience, and these pressures are not as high, they think, as the other constraints, the economic constraints, and a certain view of social success. And yet, although these households seem to repress their ecological conscience, they seem to have eco-friendly or virtuous uses of energy. What's noteworthy is that they're green without realizing it. Or at least they're not actively green. They don't claim to be green. We can give you a number of practices that they described in order to reduce their use of energy: carpooling, wood heating, turning off the heater in the daytime and putting on the jumper, using self-production to avoid some purchases. This list is not exhaustive, but this is something that they promote in their discourse, and it's all related to economic constraints because they want to pay less And we said that the most sustainable households were the poorest because they don't travel. And here, this is not as extreme, but it's the same idea. And these cost-effective or virtuous practices are also applied to housing, especially heating costs are big expenditures that are more visible and things that people may reduce more easily. But in the territories that we looked at, transport is essential, especially car transport. To sum up, there are ecological practices that are not actively promoted as green, but they are simply ways of better coping with peri-urban standards and economical constraints. It's also due to the fact that they're close to greenery, the return to the countryside, and that gives rise to ecological practices, but not actively green ones. And I'll hand back over to Yves. Based on this analysis of underlying practices, we see that all the various aspects of the vice have relative effectiveness. And this opens up the scope for further research, especially to guide public policy in order to change these practices based on the ineffectiveness of environmental demands on practices themselves. We are encouraged to move away from guilt-inducing policies, inducing guilt about these bad uses, because all these policies would be in vain. However, one lever that can be used is the economic aspect. In that case, maybe public policy could promote and value eco-friendly practices based on economic considerations, removing the stigma attached to it. And regarding social peri-urban standards, one avenue for action would be to promote a peri-urban ideal, people being sustainably rooted in their territories, and something that would not be identified with an unsustainable peri-urban standard. Here, that harks back to the use of showing these detached houses in communications by developers or government communication, which is also trying to promote energy efficiency. Maybe these types of public or private communication could be reoriented towards more sustainable goals. Public policy could also promote more research to look at these issues not at a given point in time, to look at what the practices are, but also look at how these practices change over the long term in order to understand how social standards contribute and see whether households will awaken to a less energy-intensive way of life in order to remove the constraints of peri-urban unsustainability. Thank you very much.
Francis Beaucire. Your comments, well, the reason I'm here is through no choice of mine. I mean, this was the. I mean, we're happy that you should be here. Well, so am I. So am I. But again, I'm not trying to impose my presence. Talking about the, as you said, the triple vice. If you've come up with such a contraption, you really need to have a patent on it. This sort of incredible type of machinery. Well, in energy you have power is needed for heating, for lighting, but also for transportation. And it's not quite the same, but the two are related. And in fact, the two presentations we heard were also connected. Now, ADEME, the energy government agency, and I think it was between 2006, 2007, we had quintiles of households. The poorest 20%. The total energy bill, housing plus transportation, was up 50%. For the wealthiest 20%, the energy bill was down 15%. For some people, energy costs went up faster than income, and for the wealthier, it was the other way around. Now, you have in peri-urban areas people that are less well off. So usually these are people that are less highly skilled, less well paid, and sometimes they have local jobs, local low-skilled jobs, maybe working in shops as or other menial jobs. Now, do we know just how many miles they travel? I mean, per level of income. And I mean, I know Mireille has spent a lot of time on this, but if you look at the number of miles traveled by more humble households, is it lower, which means that they spend less money on transportation if they travel less. So the real issue is the bottom line. I mean, what is the price level of energy that brings about a change in mobility patterns and in mobility practices? And it looks as though the price of energy has got to go an awful way up before it makes a difference to households. But for well-to-do households, the price of energy has got to go an awful way up, maybe less so for the less well-off. Now, if you look at the price of energy for travel in fossil fuel, it was stable till the 80s, then went up again after the mid-2000s, but it's not back to where it was in the 1980s. So I don't know if we can draw exact mathematical conclusions, but it looks as though the price of energy has got to rise an awful lot in order to bring about a change in mobility, including for more humble households, even if they travel, even if they don't travel as much. I mean, this is where the economy and the ecology come together. This is an area you haven't broached, so maybe this was a bit misplaced. It wasn't misplaced at all. I looked at some humble households. Some of them did have local jobs. Others had more distant, more remote jobs. Many blue-collar workers in the Dijon area, some in the Seine-et-Marne area. Many of them worked either in Paris or in the outskirts of Paris, even though they lived further afield. Now, looking at the price of energy, you have different practices in the Dijon area. Carpooling amongst blue-collar workers has existed for some time, and it's especially because of the high prices of gasoline. You have a lot of carpooling. In the Paris area, many households use public transportation when public transportation is accessible, or where their jobs are accessible by public transportation, if only because these are not very well to do, and the employer pays half the rail pass, and of course the employer will not pay for their gas bills, for their car bills. So of course they have an incentive to use public transportation right there. Now, I didn't inquire about the total transportation budget. Some of them came up with a spontaneous figure, others couldn't. It depended on all sorts of factors, whether there are children at home, whether there's somebody working, whether it was a working couple, only one parent worked, and so that makes a difference in terms of transportation needs. Also, the rate of change of transportation of the energy bill, and for equal transportation, a sudden increase in energy prices can bring about a sudden change, whereas a gradual change will not necessarily bring about such a change in behavior. Are you happy with this answer, the answer from Francis? Francis is delighted with the answer. Let's have a quantitative approach. I don't want to bore you with too many figures, but you know who it is we're talking about. So a quantitative approach, but also a qualitative approach as to what difference it makes to lifestyle, both in terms of housing and in terms of mobility. So this is, well, let's start with a map showing the energy consumption of households in the Paris area, the greater Paris area. You see territories in red, housing vulnerable populations, and here you're looking at theoretical consumption. It is theoretical to do with the features of the existing capacity, that is, the facilities, the houses, the way in which the houses are heated, etc. 3/4 of the houses, if you look at the criteria of the Environmental Roundtable, the Grenelle de l'Environnement, 3/4 of the houses should be rehabilitated. People living in on average, spend 1,300 euros if they live in the Paris area, 1,800 euros if they live in detached houses, but only 1,000 euros if they live in fuel-heated houses. And you can see that these areas on the right-hand side of the map use a lot of fuel, but do not necessarily spend a lot of money. This other map shows the way modes of transportation. You have two phenomena. On the one hand, people use cars more as they live further away from Paris. And in 2010, it is only in peri-urban areas that people use more cars, whereas in the rest of the area, the car use is stabilized. And the distances traveled are longer in peri-urban areas. So peri-urban areas is where people are energy vulnerable because of the long distances, the long commuting distances. But this average conceals great diversity. So people do travel a lot, but there are significant polarities in the Paris area. Jobs in the outskirts of Paris are very often local jobs, and here you have people who live and work in the same city or in the next city, and you have cities like Meaux, Coulommiers, Provins, Étampes, Rambouillet, cities where this is the case. But of course, it makes a difference depending on the type of people. And there again, when you live in the outer rings, you have a greater chance of working close to home if you are a blue-collar worker or middle management as opposed to a white-collar or high executive, especially, or if you're a man rather than a woman. Now, you're talking about vulnerability. You have to look at the actual resources, the income. This is the median income of households, and it gives you a sort of a map, a social map, and a socio-geographical map. And so on the west, people are better off, whereas in the eastern part of the greater Paris area, the households are less well off. But while the West is becoming wealthier, disparities are greater in the eastern part of Paris, which goes to show that there are some households whose situation is improving. It is not one and the same. Now, the question is, how can one measure energy vulnerability? People living in the greater Paris area spend less than 10% of their income on housing, but 400,000 people spend more than 10% of their income on energy, and so they are found to be in a situation of energy precariousness. This is one household in 10 in the greater Paris area, especially with older homeowners whose homes are as old as they are themselves. And so while this is a measure of vulnerability, it doesn't, you have people who have small electricity bills but do not heat their houses and they live in the cold. And you have 150,000 households living in the Paris area who decide to stay cold simply because they can't afford to heat up the home. And then you have people, young people, who have bought their first home, who use electric radiators in households, in houses that are supposed to be energy efficient, and so whose energy bill can be quite low. Regarding mobility, we look at vulnerability there. So same as for housing, we try to have an estimate of the money spent on the car or on travel. If you look at fuel, car fuel, but also maintenance as insurance for the car, plus sometimes you have to rent a parking space. The overall cost is on average 6% of the net income of a household in a greater Paris area. Ile-de-France, 380,000 households have got to spend more than 15% on the income on the cars. So the average is only 3.5% in Paris, but it's upwards of 10% in the Peri-urban area, and indeed in some cases it can be more than 20% for one household in 10. So just on automotive costs, and so these households with the highest costs do not necessarily live in one department more than another. The largest amount of money spent are with people with households with two cars or more, and usually diesel engine cars. And that's interesting because even though there is a lot of money spent, they try to bring the cost down because of the choice of a diesel engine car. But you have to qualify this. You have to look at the number of miles that are to do with well, commuting to work. I mean, that is and this is more limited in peri-urban areas more than in city centers. You have to see that people with children have less flexibility, and so they simply haven't got the liberty to drive around. They can't afford it, and they haven't got the time anyway. And the whole purpose of this survey now is to try and quantify this dual vulnerability to do with housing and mobility. And then the next question will be, are there the same households accumulating these expenses both on mobility and housing? Well, how can these households reduce their consumption? What are the rooms for maneuver? We find that when households are connected to their homes, especially when buying the house was a major financial effort or major financial sacrifice. And when they move out to peri-urban areas, people are not looking simply for cheaper property. Very often there are family connections, and we'll get to that. The people are also looking for an environment conducive to education, or indeed an environment that will be close to nature. And so these are elements, reasons mentioned by denizens. And so when people move, it's not simply to save on energy, or when they do this, they move out to better equipped areas with better facilities, better than what they would find in a city center. Now, households believe that in terms of consumption, then they can keep the heating bill down, and they monitor their bills carefully. And this is, of course, to do with the fact that they feel they have to control their expenses. When this goes along with values of low consumption, no wastage, a sort of general philosophy, which is in a way, of course, amplified by price fluctuations, because, of course, when you do not know when what the bill will be a few years down the road, of course, you want to be careful. Now, when households find themselves in precarious situations, you have two profiles. Number one, elderly households living in poorly insulated homes who are another motivated, nor indeed financially capable of insulating their homes, and because of their old age, they simply cannot negotiate on heat, and so they will make savings elsewhere. The second type of households, you're looking at people, working people, but low-income working people who are paying back a poorly insulated home, and so they do patchwork to fix their homes, but they will adjust the temperature in the house, giving more heat to the children's room than their own. These, of course, for households that cannot have fuel oil in the tank or use an electric radiator. The radiator may be too expensive, and so very often the electricity, the radiator will be shut off simply because they can't afford it. Now, while such people claim they're saving on energy, at the end of the day, there's not that much they can do on that regarding the energy bill. There's not much. They do not know where to get advice. Very often these households fall in the pitfalls of solar panels or heat pumps, and of course they are told that they should use less energy to protect the environment, even though they are already low consumers. But surveys have shown that households in these peri-urban areas deny the amount of money they spent on energy. They do not know how much is spent on transportation, or either they want to avoid the issue altogether, or they underestimate the amounts. Now things have changed. Now we find that households are more willing to talk about this, and they have more specific numbers. If they buy a car, it will be either a diesel engine car, a low consumption car. Very often now it is no longer taboo to say we'll try and save money on this, especially on mobility, especially because you're looking often at people spending as much as 20% of their income on travel. Now, of course, if people stay where they live, they have to make adjustments, and so they have to rearrange their lifestyles. They have to give up on certain things. You have to see that proximity does exist in peri-urban areas. You saw it in Martine and Claire's presentation. Very often you have people who like to live in the peri-urban area. If they can develop a richer social life, getting involved in community work, going to local shops, getting involved in volunteer work, that sort of thing will mean that they are better involved in the local community. They will travel less, but proximity doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with accessibility, especially for senior citizens. There are a few meters that these older people simply cannot walk between their homes and the center of town. The nice thing is, of course, when there is solidarity between neighbors, carpooling, and that sort of thing, also family solidarity is what will enable older people to get around with their children driving them and not go to a retirement home, even though, of course, for school buses, the schedule is non-negotiable. But people who haven't got that sort of solidarity will feel more vulnerable. So with this sort of socializing, making sure you don't forget buying the baguette on the way back from work, or making your own bread means that you can make sure you travel less. Or sometimes people say, well, look, instead of traveling, you take advantage of the garden and the car stays in its parking space. So this means that people go to some lengths to maintain their lifestyle, but it doesn't make them less vulnerable because they're never far away from a problem, and the slightest disorder in a precarious system means that the whole thing can collapse. So you are dealing here with vulnerable people, but they are resilient. They know how to be resourceful when facing these economic challenges, and they find themselves better suited to meet environmental challenges, but they remain suspicious of such such solutions as may be offered by by government. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
So, Francis Beaucire, you believe that proximity may be a way to resist challenges? Well, it's true. There are various ways of doing this. I mean, round tables have shown this again and again. Now, if there's one lesson to be learned of this session, and what Jean-Pierre said earlier on, for a long time, it was felt that proximity, having things on hand, was not relevant geographically speaking. But now, if you listen to various forms of discourse, proximity now has come to the fore. And this is not just theoretical. You find this in the field. Now, was this already there 40 years ago? Was this seen 40 years ago? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. I believe this has only recently come to the fore. Now, one small comment. For a long time, the limiting factor, what made things challenging, was the time it took to commute, the commuting time to go to work. Now there's a new factor that has stepped in, which has added itself to the situation, and that is the price of energy. The number of miles traveled comes at a cost. It used to be that fuel was not so expensive, but now it is, and so. I mean, this may be simplifying things, but before the time energy was an issue, almost everybody could afford to drive around. Well, maybe not everybody, but say the middle class could certainly afford to travel, and this was not socially discriminating. I mean, you could have a bigger or smaller house, a bigger or smaller garden. You could be closer or further away from the motorway, but at the end of the day, everybody could have a car and drive it. But now, when the price of energy comes into the picture, comes into the equation, this is a discriminating factor, because the middle class, the peri-urban middle class, finds itself challenged by that. And I think this is new, or if it isn't, I haven't been reading the right books. But I think this is something new, something that used not to exist. I mean, there was discrimination in the suburbs where you have lots of social housing, and the dark green was in the Seine-Saint-Denis, and the light green was in Seine-et-Marne. I mean, you have some geographical locations, and I'm telling Jean-Marc Koffner he should buy new books because he hasn't been reading the right books.
Merci beaucoup, Francis Beaucire. Quand on a préparé avec Francis Beaucire cette table ronde,
when Francis and I prepared this, we felt that turning to you, innocent Chirisa, we felt that these are the true poor people in Africa, and that of course will give a totally new dimension to the concept of poverty, because you have people living in precarious conditions in France, but in Africa it's another story altogether, isn't it? It's another order of magnitude, and it will be of great interest to listen to talk about another kind of poverty than the one you have in France and Europe. So you have the floor. Do press the green microphone. Beg your pardon. Do press the green remote control.
Changer de slide.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm coming from a totally different context, as has been highlighted. And Zimbabwe is a country in sub-Saharan Africa where really poverty, in terms of income poverty, energy poverty, housing poverty, etc., is really an issue. So I'm going to to say, how do the poor survive in the peri-urban, and how do they meet their energy and the transport needs? As you can see from that picture, that's typical of a household member who is trying to survive. What you see in that cart is a log. When I asked him, how much does it cost? You know, I'm interviewing him there. He tells me it costs $4, and you know, this is just too little for survival. Right. The purpose of this paper, really, or of this presentation, is to demonstrate how peri-urban dwellers sustain themselves for energy provision. And I applied the interpretive inductive approach to try and understand the peri-urban energy dynamics among the poor in most households. And the case which I give is Zimbabwe in sub-Saharan Africa, in the global south. And overall, the study is it considers the chaotic energy situation in a place called Epworth, which is just outside Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe. Just to put certain things in context, Zimbabwe is a country which has 10 provinces, of which two of them are metropolitan, that is Harare and Bulawayo. And it has a population of about 13 million, according to the recent census, which was carried out in 2012. Now, the country has a serious problem of urban primacy. We have the population in the country lives in Harare, that is about 4.5 million, lives in Greater Harare. We should also draw to your attention that from 1997 to 2008, there was a serious economic and political crisis in the country, which stemmed from the controversial land reform which the country embarked on. Again, in 2005, the government demolished households and businesses operating outside the formal framework through an operation that was called Operation Murambatsvina, that is take away the filthy. And this inflation which I talked about, it really peaked in 2008, thanks to the government of national unity, which came in office in 2009. Like in most sub-Saharan countries, really peri-urbanization is a complex and obtaining reality. I would briefly talk about Greater Harare region, which includes places like Rua, Chitungwiza, then Harare Core, Epworth, and Norton. So Epworth is one of the settlements in the peri-urban of Harare. And that is just a map of what we call the Greater Harare. The yellow part there shows the central part of the city, and then it's surrounded by several human settlements which are of different characteristics. Some are middle income, high income, low income, but the Epworth, which I'm zeroing in, is a low income, low density residential area. About Epworth, this settlement began as far back as 1892. You know, Harare, or Zimbabwe, was colonized by Britain in 1890. So, and they established a capital, which became Harare. But just some 9 kilometers away, they emerged this settlement called Epworth. And recent estimates, they say the population in 2010, it was estimated to be around 500,000. Then by 2012, there's an estimate that it has grown to about 700,000. And as you can see, that's growing to be really a menace, almost becoming a mega settlement. And one thing which you know to note is that 70% of Epworth dwellers are not connected to the electricity grid, and you really would wonder how do they survive. Well, that is Epworth. It has 7 wards. Now about peri-urban mobility and energy in the settlement. As I have indicated, it's really a complex reality. And like most countries where governments are obsessed with other policy agendas and they don't really put peri-urban areas as a priority, the same applies to this kind of settlement. The majority of dwellers in Epworth are low-income earners, surviving mainly from less than $2 a day, and activities are mainly in the informal sector because unemployment in Zimbabwe at the moment is around 70%. And as such, most have to find ways to self-employ, or it's a do or die situation. In the rural areas, again, where the farms have been seized from the white farmers, it becomes very unlivable. So normally they come to Harare, and then they find that the cost of living in the city is too high for them. Then they decide to resettle in the peri-urban, and that explains why Epworth is swelling, is growing. Now, there were efforts in the 1980s. Zimbabwe got its independence in 1980. So in the 1980s, around 1986, there were efforts to upgrade part of this informal settlement called Epworth, which was soon to be abandoned because around 1990, the government embarked on what is called the Structural Economic Adjustment Program. And this meant that very few effort or very little effort should be put towards the public sector investment. So the upgrading program was abandoned. So in the upgraded part of Epworth, which I can put as just 1/7 of the settlement, that's where we find a bit of grid electricity. Now, because of that, the households have found new ways to have their energy, and one way is to use sawdust, which they get from nearby sawmill industries around Harare and around Rua, and they have to transport that sawdust. And in a few moments, I will show you the slide how they sometimes use it. But also, you see that they use firewood, which they get mainly from nearby farms, and some of the farms are really far off, sometimes more than 100 kilometers away, and private transporters, bulk transporters. When I interviewed one of them, they said, well, sometimes it costs them around $600 or $700 to both buy the logs and transport them to Epworth. Some alternative methods to have energy include use of plastics, solar, paraffin, diesel for generators. So as I indicated, that photograph on the left corner, it shows part of the settlement, which is the electricity grid, but as you can see, it's not even well maintained, and some pylons are as if they are already falling. And they bring these logs from the farms, and then they have to cut it. That gentleman there is trying to cut it into pieces, which are then sold around 50 cents, and that's how the poor. But getting 50 cents is not. It's quite a task, and they normally take one of those split logs, and what you see there is some kind of a technology which they've put. It's sawdust, which they put in a container, suppress it, make a hole, just use some firewood, just a little firewood. So they have to reserve quite their energy, but they say once they have that kind of arrangement, they can cook for the night and they have a meal. And when we look at Epworth, it shows a number of interesting and critical patterns and dynamics of how individuals and households move their goods from one point to the other. And mobility can be mapped at two levels: intra-settlement and inter-settlement. What do these households do? How do they move about within the settlement? You know, as I indicated to you, most depend on informal livelihoods, like peri-urban agriculture, like trading in the street. So there are movements within the settlement, trading, going to get some firewood in the woodlots around, which are, of course, are diminishing, and that's why they have to resort to further settlements. Then inter-settlement patterns include movement to the big city, which is Harare, some 9 kilometers away, sometimes to get the plastics, which I said, to do some PC jobs, as they are called. The movement, which involves trucking, actually, is also part of the inter-settlement, where logs are brought into the settlement. Some of the inter-settlement patterns, inter-settlement mobility, it involves moving about very long distances, like Mvuma bringing in firewood or maize in times when there are droughts, to name a few of these. Right. You'd also find that some of the dwellers in Epworth, they also find employment in other parts of the city, places like Mount Pleasant, Greendale, Hatfield. These are high-income areas where some work as security guards, others work as domestic workers there, and then they travel back to their home of habitation. But we should also see that, well, there's some commuter omnibuses as one avenue through which these people get to work. Others cycle, others really walk, and walking is considered as cost-saving, you know, spending money. Someone would rather waste his body than spend the dollar or 50 cents that he or she finds. Some within the settlement, they use things like wheelbarrows, and as I mentioned, high trucks are hired in bringing bulk loads of wood logs, which are then sawn to produce small pieces of wood that is now turned into firewood. What are some of the lessons? Well, the environment around Epworth, as I've indicated, this settlement started as far back as 1892, so it's more than a century now. And you can imagine what the situation is like now. What used to be huge forests, now they are depleted, and energy becomes a really critical issue. But we should also note how the informal sector is playing a key role in providing energy for domestic use. In terms of how households organize themselves, we see mainly getting firewood, say from the market or from the woodlot, is mainly a women business. This is how culture in our place is defined as a highly patriarchal society. It's women who do the household chores, collecting firewood, fetching water, and the like. What would I recommend? For recommendations, there are issues to do with social mobilization around dissolving issues of gender, so that women also are relieved of these duties, or at least the duties of carrying wood or firewood are distributed between men and women almost equally. The government or the local authorities should find sustainable ways of providing energy for these settlements. There may be need for private-public partnerships in ensuring that there are decent energies in airports, just like any other peri-urban area in Africa. Because employment is really a critical issue, and it's not there. Well, the informal sector should be really modeled so that there's capacity building and improved provisioning of energy. There's also need to harness local energy in the formulation of local knowledge in the formulation of robust energy provision mechanisms, which is quite rather a mouthful thing. Generally, in Epworth, as in perhaps in most peri-urban areas in Africa or in Zimbabwe, the issue of carrying capacity is a critical issue. As I mentioned, the settlement is growing demographically, and it's a very speed rate, and really relying on natural resources in its own right. It's unsustainable. How to matters of carrying capacity and this growth, how can they be measured? That's a 1 million question. Also consideration of use of modes of transport, new forms of energy from industrial byproducts, depicting necessity as the mother of invention. So basically, this is my story, where the issues of sustainability, the issues of resource depletion, the issue of increasing growth. You know, Africa is one of the fastest urbanizing regions in the world today, and it's faced with such surmountable challenges. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Innocent Chirisa. That was very interesting. Personally, Francis Beaucire, what really struck me trying to connect that with what was said earlier, in France, energy is a resource for mobility. You try to cut your mobility to save on energy, whereas in Zimbabwe, or at least in Epworth, mobility is driven by the quest for energy. You move around to get energy. Francis Beaucire, what do you think of that? Yes, it was very nice saying that. No, that's very interesting. Really. Necessity is the mother of invention. That's what you said. Necessity is the mother of invention. Well, when you hear what's just been said, well, first of all, I would like to ask you a question. Since this morning, we've been saying, oh my God, connections between trains are sometimes a bit late. The bus left the station 5 before the train arrived. The people who don't have a lot of money in the Peri-urban, well, maybe instead of visiting Volvicon Castle with their car on a Sunday, will stay and have a barbecue at home. What's your take on all that? Because after the presentation that you've just made, we can see that we're living on different planets. The scale of the problems is completely different, but I think that there's a connection between the problems. Necessity produces inventions that are not necessarily institutional, but since this morning you've been hearing about our own problems, which seem very big for us. But maybe you can tell us something about what you've been hearing since this morning.
I would say what you are experiencing here, if you would put someone from Africa in this context, he or she would think, well, they are already in heaven. Because the challenge is there, well, I mentioned employment is really a big issue. And whatever is got as income, as a dollar, try as much as possible to save it. But at one's own expense, bodily, and the like. So, well, your challenges in this part of the world, I think if you give them to an African, they will really smile and say, well, these are not challenges, they are really a big opportunity, at least to venture and well, it's really a luxurious situation. But I should also say, well, they've learned to live or adapted to live with that situation. And when you read or in some discourses, you would really see that some scholars, they even think, well, they are so content with the situation as it is. But I think it's also a question of exposure, because they've never, quite a number have never experienced this. They don't know how a tram really works, and it's really a different environment, a different one.
Francis Beaucire, are you happy with the answer? Yes, quite. I mean, that's what everyone expects. But what I take home from that for SNCF is that if there were more African travelers, that would be heaven for SNCF. That's interesting. Anyway. But coming back to the parallel, I mean, the point of having that presentation in the roundtables that we've had is to show that if we completely refocus our issues, trying to see whether there are similarities. It seems that there are no apparent similarities, but still, here we heard about people who are transforming their lifestyles marginally in order to absorb new constraints that did not exist previously. In the case that we're looking at right now, energy constraints. What we're seeing in the presentation that you made is that the people that we saw, the people that you talked about, spend an awful lot of time for survival, subsistence activities. Just for the household to survive, they need to spend all that time. But increases productivity gains in developed countries mean that all the time that you spent on survival activities has been cut down. And that's why you could produce to sell and export. And here, I'm transposing things. These scales are not the same, but if you transpose things, the price of energy for humble households in the peri-urban, that's a mobility problem. I mean, they can make do at home. But if the ingenuity that they need to show in order to absorb future increases in energy costs that will really challenge their lifestyles, well, they'll probably spend more time implementing new, inventive, innovative strategies to substitute these energy sources. And here we're talking about the level, price level again. At what level of fiscal disruption will the peri-urban lifestyle be compromised? I think that there are still some considerable room ahead of us, and that explains why so far peri-urban areas are not doomed. the peri-urban momentum has not stopped. It may not grow so fast, and I'm not even sure about that. That depends on places, but I think that there's still some way to go. That may not be true. So I think that the parallel between that presentation and those that we heard previously, I think the roundtables are pretty well designed. You can give credit to the organizers. And that lets us ask the question of how much extra time should we spend on substitution activities where we need to be more ingenious and do things ourselves that we used simply to buy. That may be a bit confused what I'm saying, but I mean, getting wood from the forest next door in Seine-et-Marne is not at all anecdotal. However, it's impossible to measure through our quantitative databases. However, qualitative surveys show that households say that they turn off the radiator and they get wood from the nearby forest. It's illegal logging, so they're not going to brag about that. They're not going to talk about that in quantitative studies. However, it does exist. And can you estimate it roughly? Not at all. Not at all. No rough idea. Well, it seems that it's growing. It's a behavior that's growing, that's found in surveys, especially in Seine-et-Marne, getting wood from the nearby forest, be it a private or public forest, but I don't have figures. There are 2 microphones over there. I simply wanted to say something about mobility. There's a strategy that hides other things that have existed for a long time. Households tend to buy cars that are more fuel efficient as the price of oil increases. And so at the end of the day, up until recently, fuel costs were mostly constant for households, and now we've reached a point, we've reached the end of that logic, and I think that now the effort related to automobile costs will have a detrimental impact on household budgets, but I don't know what the threshold is. Yes, to echo your question about the figures that we can put on these informal or even illegal practices, I would refer you to the quantitative survey conducted based on the census by Alter Bourgogne, which is the Burgundy Energy Agency, done in 2007, and I think that based on lower reported energy consumption, they saw the wood effect in some parts of the territory that they surveyed. And it seems that a fraction of the population escaped the energy pressure through illegal logging. And to echo that presentation, the parallel between 2 contexts that challenge our implicit or explicit standards, and that put the debate in a broader societal context about energy consumption. However, in the presentations that we've heard today, several times I saw similarities with areas that I've surveyed, not in France, but in Chile, in Santiago, where the capital city, which is fairly affluent. It's not in the rural areas of Chile, but you can find the same tensions. People don't live in the central city, they live on the outskirts, and so the alternative solutions are for them being involved in informal work and following things that are based on the family nucleus, trying to live near their family members. And people try to invest in local resources, or they invest in mobility. And I was not familiar with the case of Zimbabwe, but there's a survey that was done by people from the Transport Economics Laboratory in Africa that shows these tensions. And it seems that the local informal setup helps people reach lower income levels than having better skills and having a job and having to walk for several hours because they don't have a choice. But the situations are similar to what Rodolphe Daudier showed. Innocent Chirisa, before your answer to Yves Jouffe, maybe we can look at a tweet for you. It seems that there are 50 people watching us live, and this is a question for you. Are there examples of innovation by new urbanites? How to use local knowledge to enhance energy provision?
Well, it's written, are there examples of innovation by the new urbanites? How to use local energy for robust energy provision? Yeah, like I indicated in my presentation, so that they don't really every time spend much money on firewood. They use together the firewood plus the sawdust, and the firewood is just to you know, when you put a log in a burning log in a sort of in a tin, and then it keeps the sawdust that is compressed burning, and you know, that way maybe a household would have used about 50 cents to cook its entire meal for dinner. That is a kind of innovation which the poor have devised. Of course, there were complaints that with the heat becomes so much, and it erodes the bases of the pots. But that's one way which I can say they have tried to, as much as possible, conserve, use little on energy. Of course, that has its own challenges, which I think, you know, like use of charcoal, coal. I don't know what type of diseases then arises. Smoke is used in closed environments, but in terms of innovation, and particularly in Epworth, that's what I know the poor have tried to do. Then the use of local energy to have robust, well, the local energy knowledge which I will talk about is knowledge from the rural. What, you know, these people are mainly people who have been in the rural areas. They have been relying on forests. And this is the kind of provision or the kind of innovation which they have now brought to the Peri-urban. Remember, I said mostly come from rural areas. They come to the big city, which is Harare. They find the cost of living there, the payment of bills and the like is not sustainable. Then they opt for the Peri-urban. And the kind of knowledge which they have is knowledge from the rural areas. Most perhaps have not really worked in the industries, in urban industries. Well, it's a bit problematic, but I would say it would need further research, contribution of even the academia to see and to advise on how they can improve their even energy and efficiencies. So it's still a gray area, really, very gray. And you know, one thing which I've learned from this is that really, well, for example, for your own information, my PhD dissertation was focusing on peri-urban areas, and it seems I was talking at something which is a phantasm, something which is out of touch and like. But then I come to this forum and I realize really it's a serious issue which is not being discussed at home, which means few people are really researching in it. So it would need further research to say, well, how do the local people interpret their situation? What is it that they are using now? How can it be improved? Because as I've mentioned, even in the existing suburbs or in the existing residential areas, which are in the urban areas, you know, there are constant power cuts, and so the energy issue maybe it's not really peculiar to the peri-urban, but also to the broader urban areas, and I would think it's through research, through development, through experimenting with what the poor are trying to do, improving efficiency in what they are ever trying to do, that would really see robustness in energy provision.
Thank you for your answer. We just have a few minutes left, 5 to 10 minutes, depending on what the organizers will decide. Maybe a bit more. After all, if everyone wants to keep talking, we won't prevent them unless otherwise specified. There's still a tweet to process, but we'll give the floor to people who are actually here. Please introduce yourself. I'm Ludovic Bouleau from sustainablemobility.com. Is that a blog? It's a website, yes. It's a multimodal information portal, mind you. I have two comments and then a question. My first comment is that twice over you claimed that people buy more fuel-efficient cars, including diesel, but there's a survey by a consumer organization that says that it's a lie that car makers peddle, that people think that they will consume less when they buy diesel cars, that they will be cheaper. But that's false, because if you drive less than 10,000 miles per year, it's not cheaper. And I hope that people don't drive that much, because if you look at the emissions, polluting emissions, that's a bad thing. And when people think that they buy a car that's more fuel efficient, there's a rebound effect, similar to people who go on a diet. If you've eaten just a salad, well, you think that you can have dessert. Well, no. If you buy a more fuel efficient car, that doesn't give you a blank check to drive more. That if you look at the mileage traveled, there's not necessarily that effort, but that effect. But you can see that in the INSEE statistical surveys, and that's the same thing that car makers are saying. So there's a perverse effect, thinking that you can drive more because your car is more fuel efficient, so it pollutes less, it consumes less, so your budget will be the same, but you can travel more. And as Francis Beaucire did, there was a survey that was published a few months or weeks ago by UFC. It's the same as you said today. A third or a quarter of people work close to home, but you said it was 10 kilometers. But in the example of Zimbabwe, Epworth, if I understood right, is 10 kilometers away from Harare, and 70% of people from Epworth never go to Harare, which is only 10 kilometers away. So it may seem short, but it's also very long. And one of the speakers said that, oh, can you imagine, they just walked 3 kilometers per day, and 10 kilometers is 3 times that. It all depends on the context, I agree. But what I'm driving at is that we live in a system where for distances that are difficult to walk, well, people tend to think, well, it's easy to drive there. But with energy becoming scarcer and more expensive, we still think on these outdated terms. We don't think in terms of the distance easily traveled constantly by everyone. I mean, walking, cycling, and a few other shared modes of transport. So I wanted to answer. I wanted to ask a question. I do like Francis Beaucire asking a previous question related to this question. People are constantly alienated by the fact that we need to use motorized modes of transport, rail, train, bus, but mostly the car, because people think that without cars you can't do anything. It was said in the preliminary report to this forum, but you can see that in Zimbabwe, having a car is not one of the possibilities for most of the population, so they invent alternative solutions. However, as was said in one of the previous presentations, if people can't move around, they'll buy a car, or I'll buy a car to move around. But then, how to teach people about alternative mobility, but everyone is taking a driving exam, and we're ready to spend 1,000 or 2,000 euros on learning how to drive. Well, maybe we could spend a few hundred, 400 to 800 euros to learn how to use alternative modes of transport, because right now there are a number of organizations that do exactly that. Alternative mobility education. And that's why, well, Bernard Salem was saying that we need to subsidize the transport services, not just infrastructure. Well, the question now is maybe we can subsidize mobility training, similar to what the job placement agencies are doing for driving licenses. Maybe another question here. Thank you. I'm Olivier Klein from the Transport Economics Lab. You were asking previously whether there were common features between what the presentation about Zimbabwe and the other presentations. So what you can see there and what you can see here. There may be one common feature, which is that our forum today doesn't really have an object. We talk about the peri-urban. We've kept talking about the peri-urban, but we said we addressed a number of issues that are not specifically peri-urban. In Zimbabwe and elsewhere, we've talked about urban poverty. Yes, you can't easily pick up wood in the city, so you need to travel long distances to get it. And in the peri-urban, there are isolated people, but there are also isolated people in the cities. And talking about bored teenagers in the peri-urban, but I mean, maybe people are also bored in the suburbs. And so we could go through a long list of questions that were addressed throughout the day, but which are never specifically peri-urban. They are related to cities and the life in our current societies. We are all more or less urban, apart from the 2% of agricultures and farmers. So beyond that, I have a question about our context. That's a question for academics. But I've been hearing about peri-urban areas for a long time. People have really castigated it, saying that it was not good, it was a source of pollution, so on and so forth. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been hearing not so bad things about it. Well, we should stop putting the blame on it. But we still don't mind it. We added to the discourse saying that peri-urban dwellers traveled longer distances and they didn't have to cope with local pollution as much as urbanites. Well, things are changing. I mean, It's good that things are changes. I mean, only stupid people never change their minds. But I was wondering whether, similar to the inhabitants of Epworth, we would need to learn how to invent new things, maybe to do away with a category which is not necessarily relevant. I mean, that's just my question, or at least my comment. According to you, the category is not necessarily relevant, but the questions were not necessarily poorly framed. Well, regarding the question about sustainability of peri-urban mobility, well, if we can't define what peri-urban means, it's difficult to answer the question. Amongst the academics who have devoted part of their lives defining the peri-urban, does someone want to answer? Okay, there. Yves Jouffe from the self-same laboratory. You're even here's manager. No, I'm no longer the director. I was the director for 11 years and then they kicked me out. Just the answer from our laboratory, we know we can precisely answer what the question that Francis asked, the thresholds at which the peri-urban becomes unsustainable. Asking the question of sustainability is the last opportunity that we have to stigmatize the peri-urban. As Olivier said, in presentations we heard that the peri-urban wasn't so bad, that there's still that last little possibility to say that it's no longer sustainable. But you'll hear the answer tomorrow in the argument, and I'll show you what the thresholds are. And Francis has already explained that these thresholds are still very remote. That's a teaser, isn't it? But you systematically exclude long-distance mobility because peri-urbanites travel long distances daily, weekly to commute to work, and that's what we're looking at, and that's what we focus on. But do they necessarily take transatlantic flights? I don't know. I'm not sure. But yes, it's true that they burn charcoal in the barbecues. Yes, you really don't like them, do you? That's good. The same question again. Amongst academics who have studied the peri-urban, does anyone want to answer Olivier's question? Olivier from LET? Or do you consider that we need to wait until tomorrow morning to start going at each other's throats? Oh, one brave volunteer here. A brave gladiator, almost. Well, that made you laugh, at least. Well, thank you. I'm Jérôme Grange from the Amiens Urban Planning Agency. I'm not an academic, I'm sorry, I'm more of a practitioner. But today, like very often when you talk about the peri-urban, the risk is that you will mix up three things. There were great minds here today, but you confuse single detached houses area, urban sprawl, and the peri-urban. As an urbanist, for me, the peri-urban is an area without services. It's an area where individual choices and the work done by local authorities to make mobility acceptable within given time budgets helped people free themselves from pedestrian constraints in order to have access to services within a consumerist culture where you have a competition between merchant services and public services. That's why this afternoon I was somewhat surprised by one of the presentations. I could see that Brie-Contrebert or Coulommiers were peri-urban places, and I looked at it on my iPhone. Brie-Contrebert has 13,000 inhabitants. The level service means that personally I don't consider it to be peri-urban. It's a balancing point for me. I was the head of the Grenoble urban planning agency, and I fought against another local authority that considered that as long as you were outside the ring road, that was a peri-urban area. You really had to struggle. Everything went to inner Grenoble, and the rest had to fight for the crumbs. But since now I am in Amiens, in northern France, I don't look at the peri-urban so positively as was shown in some approaches. And there's one thing that I'm more dubious, more doubtful about, the sustainability of balancing point. There were positive things about more shops being opened and new jobs being relocated. But if you look at realities, for the greater Amiens, in Amiens you have 155,000 people, and in the urban areas there are 4 centers of attraction of over 5,000 people. Now, all national public services, municipalities have 5,000 to 10,000 people, but courts closed down. The hospital is leaving, is being closed, and other services will be closed down because they want to streamline public services. And now the strategies by economic operators, including private operators, whatever people said about thinking local, but I'd like to recall that last year 4.2 million square meters were earmarked for construction, and they were not in free areas, but in the metropolitan area. And so what I don't quite like in what was said is that there's a metropolitan view of other areas. So a part of 10 main conurbations in France, all the rest would be peri-urban. Thank you for that comment. That will add grist to the mill of some, but that won't bring us any further. Francis Beaucire, maybe you'd like to respond to what Jérôme Grange said? And maybe Olivier? Well, I agree with the fact that peri-urban is an umbrella term for a lot of things, but we agreed today on the fact that there are different types of geographical setups. So I think that Jérôme is right when he says that, but we need quick presentations. We saw that for Montreal. Montreal is in fact a sort of residential suburb. I agree with that. Regarding the issues of small cities, which are major aspects on the outskirts of big conurbations, you were talking about Coulommiers and Brie-Contrebert. I won't talk about Brie-Contrebert, but Coulommiers is a small town. And in the presentation that was made about young people from Coulommiers, whether they know what a big city looks like, well, those who go to university don't. But anyway, still, the findings of the survey are valid, but personally, I wouldn't classify Coulommiers as peri-urban. It's the far outskirts of Paris, which is a fuzzy term, but it's a good thing that it's so fuzzy. And that sort of peri-urban fabric has central centers of local centers of attraction, and that's why the average commute mileage for people working in the peri-urban is 4 kilometers, because there are these small centers of attraction. And Coulommiers is in a is somewhere in between. But anyway, Olivier Klein said that it was no longer necessary to wrap our heads around these problems. But we spent the whole day trying to generalize the peri-urban lifestyle, but with increasing complexification, the peri-urban looks like other types of geography. We may ask how it's going on the outskirts or in the suburbs, which is not the same as the outskirts, or the peripheral districts in central cities. We could have really broken it down more finely. And so the peri-urban exists on its own merits, and I mean, it becoming so mainstream is the outcome of 40 years of urbanization. It's high time we realized it happened. Yves Jouffe, are you happy with that answer? What do we need to identify in urban spaces? Well, what I'm concerned about is that putting a geographical category on things, as long as you define the peri-urban, I mean, there was one definition based on services, or it's a matter of distance, or a matter of built environment continuity. That's what I've heard about the peri-urban. But all that might brush a number of things under the carpet, things that were discussed in the presentations, issues of income disparity, social gaps. There are poor people in the peri-urban, in the suburbs, and I'm not sure that the availability of services is just a matter of geographical availability of services. This morning we've talked about immigrant women stuck in their houses in the peri-urban, but that also exists in the suburbs, and these women have a bus stop at the bottom of their building. But you need really to define what you're studying. However, you don't necessarily need to put geographical labels on them that way. And anyway, there are a lot of people who are looking at urban spaces without necessarily referring to the peri-urban. That's also true. Are there any further questions, requests for the floor? That will be the very last question. Please keep it short. I'll take the microphone. Olivier, thank you. I'm Claude Soulages from IFSTA. We talked already this morning, and it's already in the program. It's a very quick comment. After what Mr. Amsalem said about issues of infrastructure and service, he said that maybe we could save money by paying taxis. Well, first of all, I'll talk about a user. I'm familiar with TER taxis in the central region of France. I use them, but it's fairly rigid because you need to book them a couple of days in advance. And it's very interesting for me because I pay €2 and SNCF sometimes pays €40. And it works well because it's limited to a small number of people, and I think that this type of on-demand transport can be used for useful for social reasons. But maybe we can invent cheaper, more massified solutions. For instance, having people cycle to stations and keeping taxis for people who really need them. That may be more costly than infrastructure, because in France people say that infrastructure costs 1 billion, but it lasts 100 years. But you need to look at the operating costs. If you only have 2 drivers to transport drivers for collective taxis, drivers for only a couple of people, that will be very costly. And here I was talking about taxis. Collective taxis are a different kettle of fish.
Francis Beaucire, would you like to add something? Well, maybe tomorrow. It's getting late. But people living in peri-urban areas, how can they sort of make up a sort of substitute urban life, sort of recreate this combination of density and looseness? I mean, is the peri-urban area unable to create this combination of density and diversity which characterizes urban life? I mean, is it impossible to recreate that sort of context, either to do the same thing as in the city or different things from the city? But can you somehow recreate these opportunities? I mean, is there a substitute for the city in the peri-urban context? That is something that we could address tomorrow, but we could possibly leave it at that.
Merci beaucoup.
In Rechten.